take any object and just assign arbitrary or set arbitrary properties on it. So I just demonstrated these pair of curly braces is a so-called object literal. So that just creates an empty object. And on this object, I set this property created to now, and I set another property called modified also to now, which is presumably sometime, very short time later. And I can iterate over all objects, over all properties of an object using the in operator, which is markedly different from other programming languages. So I can just have this for loop over all properties in this object X. Okay. I pointed out already earlier that methods are just, or functions are just values, or they are objects, and therefore they can be values of variables or properties. So, and what I just explained is exactly this. That is, of course, also functions can be the values of properties of objects. So, and if a function is the value of a property of an object, then I can invoke this function as a method of this object. And that just doesn't mean that much. It only means that inside this function, there is this special, it is not actually a variable, but it looks like a variable and feels like a variable, this. And the value of this is just the object on which I just called this method as a function. That is, I have this function, which just doesn't look any different from any other function. So, and I just assign it to a property of this object X, which is supposedly just the object X from the previous page, or from the previous slide. So now this property touch of X has a value that is of a type function, and therefore I can call it. And I just call it by appending these parentheses, or by applying the call operator on this value. So, and by that way, I just invoke this method. And if I invoke this method, then I see that the method refers to this. And because I invoked it as a method on this object, this will be X when the method is executed. So that's how methods on objects work in JavaScript. A next very surprising thing is how the new operator works in JavaScript. And again, in JavaScript, as I explained, there are no functions. There are no classes. Still, I can create objects using the new operator. And what this means, I'm going to explain now. The argument to the new operator is actually just a function. So it is just, as we've seen before, we have a function, and we just pass the name of the function as an argument to this new operator, as we do here, for instance. So we have a function called f, and this is an entirely normal function, except that I gave it a name that starts with a capital letter to distinguish it from other functions that start with a lowercase letter, because I want to use this function as a constructor, that is to pass it as an argument to new, but there's really no difference inside the language between those functions. So now what I'm doing is I say new f. So, and what happens if I say new f? There happen three things, two of which I can also express in other ways in JavaScript. Only the third thing is actually the interesting one. So the first thing is I create an empty object, which I can just do using this empty object literal. The last thing that happens is that I execute this object, that I execute this function f with this newly created object set to this. And I explained earlier that functions are objects, and therefore functions also have methods. And one of these methods are methods that actually call this function or invoke this function. And this function apply does exactly this. That is, f_apply x just invokes this function as a method of the object x, as I explained before. And now a third thing happens in between, which is very bizarre and very nifty, actually. So a function has a property called prototype. And this I'm going to show you in an example again. Here I defined a function point. And you see this function point takes two arguments, x and y. And as you see later, this function has a property prototype. And prototype is just an object. And to this object, or on this object, I can set properties. So, and after I call this new operation, like here, like you see here, with new point 1, so after I call this, I have an object, and there's, and now it gets interesting. So now this object has actually its prototype set to this prototype property of point, which means the following. Well, you've seen that I can set arbitrary properties on arbitrary objects. So, and I can also try to read arbitrary properties on arbitrary objects. Now, if I try to read a property from a given object, and this object doesn't happen to have set this property, then the property is looked for on its prototype. So, that is, if I create an object here, something like point, and then I try to read the property toString, for instance, on this object, which implicitly happens if I try to convert this property into a string, which happens if I pass it to this function alert. Then, of course, this object doesn't have any property toString defined on it. So, but it has a prototype, and this prototype has this property toString defined on it. So, what happens then is that this property, or the value of this property, is looked up on its prototype. And this mechanism is called delegation. So, and that's the closest what we get to classes in JavaScript. And classes, well, as I said, don't exist, but if we associate a bunch of objects, all with the same property, and all with the same prototype, and then on this prototype just set some methods, then all this bunch of objects has the same method, or at least they don't have the methods, but we can call the methods on them. And this just feels like all these objects are of the same class, although, well, as I said, there is actually no such thing as a class. There's just a common object that method invocations or property accesses are delegated to. The interesting thing is that if I change the prototype property of this constructor, after I've created some objects from it, also these objects will see the modified prototype. That's very nice. So I can create a bunch of objects and then afterwards change their type or change their behavior. Okay, so much for this. Now I have to hurry a little bit because I only have 6 minutes left. Anyway, so much for this. Now back to the Maps API, where we see some more instances of doing this, or of working with JavaScript. Actually, I wanted to make a brief remark about polymorphism and about this idea of calling functions as methods on objects as opposed to have just free functions and passing these objects as arguments to them. You'll notice that the only difference of a free function that receives an object as an argument and a function being called as a method on an object is that this object is assigned to this inside the function. So if I would just pass instead the object as an argument, it wouldn't matter. So it would just be the same, except I want to do different things on different objects and call them by the same name. So something like toString, for instance. So I have different objects, and on all of these objects I want to call toString. And these objects should do different things or should return different string representations depending on their type. And in that case, this case is actually the only case in which it makes sense to define functions as a method on objects. Okay, so much for this. Let me briefly wrap up because I'm running out of time. The last thing I wanted to demonstrate is that this Maps API, this Maps API provides ways to put things on the map. So, and one class of things to put on the map are controls, which are these things like the things to change the type of the map, to change it to a map or to a satellite images or to both overlaid on top of each other. Then this control to change the zoom level or to pan around. And down here is a scale that is also an object that is put on the map. Okay, just to demonstrate that briefly, the way to do that is to call this addControl method on the map object and pass them instances of different types of objects. And that's actually why I made this remark about polymorphism. Here we have instances or objects of different types that are used in the same way by this method addControl of the map object. So and I have here different objects, and these different objects all happen to implement a function called, or a method called initialize, that just receives the map object, and they do different things. So the map control draws these, well, different types of controls on the map. And that's actually one of the few occasions where polymorphism or calling functions as methods on objects really makes sense. So in JavaScript, there are not that many of these occasions, actually. Yeah, so much for now. It was a little bit tight, actually, and I didn't get to demonstrating events. So just as DOM elements fire events, also the map object fires events, and these events can be handled. For instance, a click event can be handled by putting things like markers on the map and removing them again, and they can also be handled, maybe? No, that doesn't work. Yeah, anyway, so I didn't demonstrate that, but that's another, or the same way what we have seen with DOM event handlers in the previous case also works on the map object. Okay, so much for now. This is, oops, this is actually it. And though I haven't gotten through all of the things I wanted to explain you, there are even more things that I've left out. And I just mentioned them here briefly. So for instance, I didn't speak about XSLT, which is also a possibility of putting HTML text on the map. And also I didn't talk about built-in types in JavaScript. So you have this type of operator that does a few things for you. I also briefly mentioned exceptions. And I didn't talk much about cross-browser compatibility, which is actually a very nifty and amazing subject to talk about. The main thing to say about it is you just need to lose respect for all of that. Don't be intimidated by all these difficulties, although it all looks tedious if you try to get into it, but that's very adventurous, actually. And the last thing I didn't mention is a very central thing connected with AJAX, which is this XML HTTP request object that is used to transfer data in the background between the server and the page that runs in the browser. Yeah, sorry for not getting to all of it, but as I said, I realized earlier that an hour is not enough to explain a whole programming language anyway. Yeah, there are a few references that I put at the end of the slide set, and I guess that the slide set will be online somewhere at the conference website so that whoever is interested can follow these links there. So much for that. Thank you for your patience and for your interest. And yeah, that's it.